So I wanted to get your take on the RT America being shut down. You have worked there for a while. We don't have to get into the specifics, but I just wanted to get your take on the censorship aspect of everything that's happened thus far.
Okay. Well, you have to imagine that somebody you know has lied to you over and over and over again. And they've just told you a number of false things. And then on top of that, they're trying to silence someone who disagrees with them. Now, if you knew somebody who was doing that, would you think that this was an honest person, that this person had right on their side? And we've seen this throughout this entire Ukraine crisis over the last couple months. They have shown us video from video games. They've shown us video from Iraq and Syria and said that it comes from Ukraine. They have lied over and over and over again. Fake news is all over the internet. Plus, they have gone out of their way to shut down RT and voices that bring the other side of the story. And if anything, I think this is just a full-on confirmation of how in the wrong the United States, NATO, and the Ukrainian government are. When they have to lie like this, when they have to silence their critics, it shows they don't have right on their side. That's my view of it.
We're having one of those shows, Caleb, when anything that possible that could happen to go wrong is going wrong. We lost Fiorella. I'm sure she'll be back in there right now. Yeah, I mean, what are your thoughts, though, is possible for the future for RT America to maybe one time bounce back? If we, let's say in America, we can mop this thing up. I remember when we had our show before and we talked about censorship, and you said it's going to get bad before it gets better, right? I think that's what you even mentioned. It's like it's going to get bad before it gets better. But is there a chance that it can get better and we might see RT America down the road one day?
Well, we all received a notice of layoff. All employees of RT America, including myself, we all received a notice of layoff. I cleared out my desk. We took our stuff out of the office. But other than that, things are still up in the air. There's a lot of things that are just not clear at the moment. And we will see what happens when the dust settles. One thing that is clear is myself and other people at RT America who are critical of what the U.S. government is saying right now and have a different perspective on this. We're not going to be silent. We're not just going to go away. We're going to keep doing it. I'm all over social media. I'm on YouTube and many other people that are associated with RT that have a critical perspective that, you know, maybe they're not associated with RT, but they're critical of this. We're not going away. We're going to keep doing this. And that's why they're so desperate to silence us. And that's what's really bizarre about this situation is they seem to think that if they stop some bank transfers or they engage in widespread social media intimidation, which I've never seen anything like this. You know, I mean, they must have their troll farms working overtime. They must be spending like millions of dollars on the troll farms because the harassment that anybody who is critical of their narrative is getting right now is so ridiculous. And do you really think that with their country in the middle of a war, you know, with bombs going off, Ukrainians are just taking the time to run to their computers and tweet in English at people who disagree with NATO? I really doubt this is coming from Ukrainians. But regardless, the social media intimidation, the cutting off of bank transactions, the harassment, it's not going to stop people from opposing their wars. So at the end of the day, I expect we will come out ahead. These are just the hard times, right? This is the darkest before dawn hour. But I'm going to keep going, and so are a lot of people I know who agree with me.
Yeah.
Go back stronger. Sorry.
No, it's okay. I agree. And I just wanted to show Caleb's tweet that he put. I don't think we've shown it. It should be 19. And you know, you said you were cleaning out your desk and it was heartbreaking that things were unclear, that you have no intention of stopping, as you just said. What specifically did you like about working for RT? Because a lot of the mainstream media and the smears there's so much control, right, over what you say, over what you don't say. To this day, I've seen the same things come at Tara Reid. And a lot of my friends work at RT or have worked at RT. So for me, I've just never heard that, but I just want to hear it from you. Like, you know, did you have some sort of like authoritarian, you cannot say this? Because that's how media works in the United States. You must get approval if you're going to attack Hillary Clinton or you'll be fired.
Well, actually, from my experience at RT, there was a much wider variety of perspectives represented at the company than at most workplaces that I've heard about. I mean, we had conservatives, we had liberals, we had libertarians, we had Marxists, we had all kinds of voices. People called RT propaganda, but propaganda puts out one particular viewpoint, and RT America didn't put out one particular viewpoint. I mean, there was conservatives, there was Chris Hedges, there was, Larry King had a show for a long time, William Shatner. There's a lot of different perspectives represented, a lot of great personalities with many different views coming forward. And I will say that there were a lot of people that had various interpretations of world events also. I mean, yes, the prevailing trend tended to be critical of what U.S. leaders said, but when it came to international events, Steve Malzberg, a big supporter of Israel, he had a TV show on RT America. He put forward his view. Chris Hedges, a longtime critic of U.S. foreign policy, he was on RT America. There were a number of different perspectives represented. So I really, the idea that RT was this stifling place and we were all, marching in lockstep with the Kremlin is absolutely ridiculous. Absolutely ridiculous. You look at who the guests were, you look at who came on, it was a wide variety of perspectives. Another thing that I will say is that this doesn't just apply to media companies, this applies to all workplaces. Right now, people are very afraid to say what they think at work. The political correctness culture has led to a situation where if you make an offhand remark or say something that someone interprets the wrong way, you can get fired. It wasn't like that at RT. Now, that's not to say there weren't people who disagreed with each other or people who took offense to other people's words, but it didn't have that kind of dangerous woke corporate culture that's kind of taking over a lot of workplaces. A lot of that have nothing to do with business, nowadays. Nowadays in the business world, people are very, very afraid they're going to say the wrong thing. They're going to tweet the wrong thing. Their boss is going to see it and they'll get fired. Wasn't like that at RT. RT was quite non-totalitarian in comparison to a lot of people I know who work at just regular companies in New York City.
Fee, do you have a follow-up or should I just shoot?
No, go ahead.
Well, I got to admit, Caleb, a lot of people, when they say, okay, Pasta, your favorite channel is RT. In fact, there was somebody who hated on us that once was friends with us and said, they have RT in their household constantly over there. It's ridiculous. And I was like, I like RT. I think it's one of the best channels around. But when I got my mom to start watching it, whatnot, and she says she's going to miss you in the streets of New York, by the way, now that it's off of DirecTV. I would have a hard time explaining this to people and kind of trying to legitimize the fact that it was somewhat sponsored by the Russian government and stuff. How did you push back when people would ask you, and I'm sure people have asked you behind, like, well, how could, a Russian sponsored or partially funded by the Russian government television show be fair and balanced?
Well, any media is going to have an editorial perspective. That's just the reality. Any newspaper, any publication, any radio program is going to have somewhat of an editorial perspective. But, they bait, RT for the fact that its funding comes from Russia. It's not a state broadcast entity. I want to make that clear, by the way. It's actually, there's a private media company in RT, RIA Novosti, and RIA Novosti gets funding, but it's not a direct government entity. It's more like PBS. PBS is a private corporation here in the United States, but it gets funding. And that's how RT works. And we got to be clear about that, right? I mean, if you're going to call RT state media, then you have to call PBS, you have to call BBC that. But beyond that, right, let's look at who the mainstream media are. You got NBC, and that's a creation of General Electric, right? General Electric is one of the top Pentagon military contractors. Fox News, another, that's the top name in cable news in the United States. At one time, Fox News was actually partially owned by the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. We know about the News Corporation and Rupert Murdoch and his views. You can go down the line. Anderson Cooper of CNN has admitted in the Washington Post the way he got his job at CNN is he worked for the CIA and they got him the job. So there's a whole lot of distortion, just a whole lot of distortion and unfair arguments. And this whole demonization of RT because it's from Russia, it's funded, that whole narrative is based on appealing to people's biases. that we give a pass to U.S. imperialism, we give a pass to Wall Street and Pentagon contractors, and we assume that whoever they're opposing, like the Russian government or the Chinese government or the Venezuelan government or the Iranian government, we assume that they're the bad guy. And that's the way these things work. And it kind of takes the onus off of who are the main perpetrators of violence in the world. I mean, Martin Luther King Jr., he famously said that his own government were the primary perpetrators of violence on this earth. And that's, I mean, if that's the case, why would you shame somebody who works for a TV network that's from one of the governments that's standing against U.S. global domination, and not shame people in mainstream media that is echoing the voices of the U.S. power structure, especially for progressive-minded people who are supposed to be critical of capitalism and Western imperialism. If anything, they should be sympathetic to RT. And a lot of them are, until this barrage of deception and hysterical allegations came out. But I think a lot of people are. I will tell you, that tweet I made about clearing out my desk at RT America, I got a barrage of sympathy. So many people who I'd never met before, never heard of, said, I am so sorry to hear this happen to you. I love RT. I may not agree with everything you've said, Caleb, but RT should still be on the air. RT should be able to operate in the United States. And what the United States is doing, the hysteria against RT, is unacceptable. There's massive opposition to this censorship beneath the surface. There's a lot of people who say, if the government bans a book, that's going to be the first book I go out and read, because that means there's something in that book that the government doesn't want me to see. I think that's people's attitude. People are seeing this and they're saying, wait a second. All right, if they're shutting down RT, maybe this means that I ought to go and listen to what RT has to say.
And just shifting too, because I think this is all obviously related. You have continuously talked about how this isn't an illegal invasion. And I have been an advocate, a very huge critic of people calling this Putin's war or calling this an illegal invasion. From your perspective, I want to hear why you think this isn't an illegal invasion, and also compare that to how the mainstream media has portrayed U.S. invasions as interventions and vice versa, up until now, where it's a Russian invasion. But never once have they called it, a U.S. invasion. They call it an intervention.
Well, I guess it depends on your definition of the word invasion, okay? Because when you talk about a home invasion, if someone comes into your house without your permission, they've home invaded you. That's an invasion by definition. However, if you use the more legal definition of it, the definition that's standard, used when discussing international affairs, an invasion is carried out with the intent to conquer, right? With the intent to take over the country, overthrow its government. That's not what Russia's doing right now. You have to understand, this started in 2014 when the United States worked with radicals and extremists in the Ukrainian far right wing to topple the government. And after that happened in 2014, the people in the eastern regions, Donetsk and Lugansk, the Donbas region, they broke away from the Ukrainian government, and they formed the People's Republic of Donetsk and the People's Republic of Lugansk, led by the communists. And they asked Russia to recognize them as independent countries. And Russia said no. Russia said, no, we want you to be part of Ukraine. And instead of recognizing them in 2014, Russia facilitated the Minsk Agreement. And the Minsk Agreement was supposed to lead to the people in the eastern regions who speak Russian as their language, who consider themselves to be Russian, are proud of the legacy of the Second World War and the defeat of Hitler. It was supposed to lead to them being reintegrated back into Ukraine. But that Minsk Agreement that was signed in 2015, it's been 7 years. That agreement has not been implemented. What has been going on over the course of the past 7 years is bombing, shelling, drone strikes, and 14,000 people in Donetsk and Lugansk have died. 14,000 deaths. They have not implemented the agreement. They are bombing these folks. They are killing them. They have a food blockade. They have killed a number of children. They have a memorial to all the children who have died. It's just, you can look at this memorial they built with stuffed animals for the children that have died. The people of these regions, the 4 million people of Donbass, they have been subject to years and years of hell. And they've asked Russia to recognize them, and Russia didn't, and they waited. And they said, no, we want the Minsk Agreement to be implemented. We want the Minsk Agreement to be implemented. And Ukraine didn't implement the Minsk agreement. Zelensky, the current Ukrainian president, got elected on the platform that he was going to bring the country back together. He was going to bring the country back together, overcome the divisions created by the U.S. coup in 2014, but he wasn't able to do it. The far right wing and the Nazi forces and other forces in the military were stronger than Zelensky was. So then, fast forward to a couple months ago, out of nowhere, you had U.S. officials announcing Russia is about to invade Ukraine. And I pay close attention. I report from the United Nations. Russian officials came forward and they said, no, we're not going to invade Ukraine. And U.S. officials just kept saying, Russia is going to invade Ukraine. They're having military exercises in Belarus. And Russia said, we do that every year. Every year we have exercises in Belarus. We told you we were going to do these exercises. We're not going to invade Ukraine. What is this about? And so in order to appease the United States, because they wouldn't let this go, Russia actually started moving their troops away from the border to make clear they were not invading Ukraine. And then we saw what this was really about. Bombs went off in Donetsk, bombs went off in Lugansk, all that shelling and mortar fire escalated. And it was very clear what was going on. Biden, he didn't like Trump. He considered Trump to be a Russian agent, and they blamed Trump, Russia for Trump getting elected, which is ridiculous. And now the Biden administration, coming out of the pandemic, was working with the Ukrainian government, and they were going to roll into Lugansk and roll into Donetsk and slaughter these people. And the idea was to intimidate Russia, to basically dare Russia to intervene and protect them, and basically put Russia into a situation where, moving in to protect them would look like they were invading Ukraine. It looked like the United States was right all along. See, they were going to invade. Well, Russia, they said, look, we are going to protect the people of the eastern regions. They granted them recognition, and they moved their forces into Donetsk and Lugansk to protect the people of the eastern regions. And then they moved ahead to take apart the Ukrainian military, to dismantle that Ukrainian military that's been bombing and shelling these people, to get rid of this huge stockpile of U.S.-made weapons that are on their border, to make clear to the Ukrainian government that they better not join the NATO coalition and threaten them right on their border. And yes, Russia is at this point protecting the people of Donetsk and Lugansk by engaging in offensive action against the Ukrainian military, ripping that Ukrainian military up so the people of the eastern regions can have peace. And so Russia does not have to deal with the threat of a NATO-aligned country right on their border. And this can stop today. All Zelensky would have to do is recognize the right of these eastern regions to be independent and make clear he's not going to join NATO and get more U.S. weapons, and this would end immediately. That has been Russia's position from the beginning. They have no intention of occupying Ukraine, taking over Ukraine, nothing. They want the threats against them to stop, and they want the slaughter of the people in the eastern regions to stop. And what's beyond me is Joe Biden, in his State of the Union speech, he referred to what Russia is doing as unprovoked. There have been 8 years of provocations, 8 years of shelling, 14,000 people dead. You want to talk about, provocations. For him to say this is unprovoked. I mean, if you watch CNN, you would just think that Putin was having a bad day and he said, I'd really like to take over Ukraine. And that's what happened. That is not what happened, right? I mean, this is a response to 8 years of shelling, attacks, and violence. This is a response to 7 years of failed attempts to reintegrate the Russian-speaking people back into Ukrainian society. I mean, let's just talk about facts here. I mean, imagine that there was some Republican or conservative right-wing governor in Texas or New Mexico, and he decided that he was going to start giving Latinos and Chicano people tickets for speaking Spanish. He was going to drag them into court, make them pay fines for speaking their own language. We wouldn't stand for that here in the United States. We'd say that's racism, that's unacceptable. We're not going to tolerate that. That's what the Ukrainian government has been doing for the past 8 years, writing Russian speakers tickets, dragging Russian people who've spoken Russian their whole lives for generations, dragging them to court for speaking their own language. They have outlawed TV networks that are critical of the Ukrainian government. They put people in jail for their social media posts that are critical of the Ukrainian government. They portray Ukraine as a democracy. It is not a democracy in any sense. The people voted for Zelensky because they wanted peace, and Zelensky didn't have the power to do it. These far right-wing extreme forces that dominate the country basically told the president they don't want to hear it. And the president was unable to actually carry out his rule. That's not democracy. And let me add, they also say Ukraine is independent. And this is a threat on Ukraine's independence. Ukraine is not independent. Ukraine is a colony of U.S. imperialism. Zelensky doesn't move without asking the permission of U.S.-backed military advisors, European Union NGOs, and strategists. Zelensky clearly doesn't run the country. He got elected promising peace, and he hasn't been able to carry it out. And there are all kinds of European Union, British, and American officials in Ukraine telling him exactly what to do. If they told him to lick the floor on national TV, he would probably do it. That's how controlled Zelensky is. So saying that this is an attack on Ukraine's independence, there's no independence in Ukraine. Ukraine's independence ended in 2014 when the United States overthrew their government.
Crazy too as well. I know, like,
that was a great
so much
summary,
to unpack.
Caleb. That was a great summary of everything a lot of us have been saying. But it's great to hear it from somebody else, so we know that we're not crazy.
Yes.
Pasta, go ahead.
Well, I've been watching Caleb his late night streams, and he's just been on fire with this and stuff. And, some things that I think we should point out is that, number one, that Caleb Maupin over here was marching and protesting for the people's rights just to live in the Donbass region before he even worked at RT. There's actual footage of that. You can see that. And I'd also like to point out too, Caleb, the fact is that Zelensky also said he was going to pursue nuclear weapons shortly before the Russians took offense. I don't think in any scenario whatsoever would the United States let an anti-United States power be on the border, let's say in Mexico, with nuclear weapons pointed at them. So it's so hypocritical of the United States government. And I believe Zelensky was pushed to say that because this is what they wanted over here, the United States, that is.
Yes, and that's my fear. It appears to me that, look, I mean, if Zelensky wants peace in the country, all he would have to do is say, all right, Donetsk, Lugansk, it's yours, and we're not joining NATO, and Russia would withdraw their forces immediately. He's not saying that. The Ukrainian military, the actual Ukrainian military, has pretty much fallen apart. What's left in Ukraine are these extremist, ultra-nationalist fighting groups, and now they are calling for international volunteers. And it appears to me that the strategy of the United States and its allies is to create a prolonged conflict. They want to make Ukraine the new Afghanistan, and they want to force Russia into a situation where they're there for a really long time, where a lot of their soldiers keep dying, where a lot of their money is spent there. That's the strategy here. And I don't know how in the world is that good for anybody. It's not good for Ukraine. That's not good for Russia. That's not good for anybody. But it's a way to further isolate Russia on the international markets. It's a way to, cut Russia out of the oil and gas markets and drive up the cost of energy and make us all pay a lot more for gasoline. It doesn't benefit anybody. And I think Russia knows this also. I think Russia is very aware that this is the U.S. strategy. Zbigniew Brzezinski, the main strategist of the United States during the late Cold War period, he talked about how Afghanistan was the Afghan trap. And the idea was to force the Soviets into a situation where they felt they had to send their military there and then keep them there as long as possible and, quote, give them their own Vietnam. And I think that, that Putin is a very well-educated man. I mean, his academic dissertation was all about how to save Russia's economy, and he did it. He took office and he did it. And it appears to me that Putin knows about Brzezinski, and he knows what the United States is up to, and that his goal is to get out of Ukraine as fast as possible. He doesn't want to fall into a trap. He wants to get out of Ukraine as fast as possible, but in order to get out, they have to accomplish their mission, which is to get security guarantees and get safety for the people of the eastern regions. And so my hope is that this war can end as quickly as possible. And I'm not happy about this. I'm not cheering about this happening. This is not a good situation at all. And my heart goes out to the people of Ukraine. It absolutely does. I mean, I can't imagine what it would be like to have war in your own country, bombs going off and all of that. But I will say this, right? There's a lot of internet grifting going on right now. A lot of people are saying, donate to Ukraine, send money here, send money there. I urge people not to do that because you don't know where that money is going. It might go to buy a new yacht or a new mansion for a pro-NATO Ukrainian oligarch. That's how cynical these forces are. I mean, they're quite wealthy and they're quite corrupt and manipulative. And even more than that, it might actually go to buy new guns and rifles and weapons for the Azov battalion and these ultra-nationalist militias, which are basically doing most of the fighting now against Russia. The actual Ukrainian military has collapsed. Seems like the Nazi and ultra-nationalist elements are taking over. The Russian ambassador to the United Nations spoke this morning. And I mean, we have no idea. We're only getting one side of the story in American media. And it's been debunked over and over again. This story about the Snake Island that was debunked. But what's actually happening on the ground is not being highlighted. These, Ukrainian nationalist militias that are not accountable to the Ukrainian government, they're kind of independent. They are preventing people from getting to humanitarian corridors. There were a group of people that were fleeing, and they blocked them from fleeing, and are basically holding them hostage in a school right now. I mean, it's really horrendous. There were a group of Chinese nationals. They're not from Ukraine. They're Chinese, and they're trying to get out of the country. And these nationalist militias opened fire on them as they were fleeing the country. What these forces are doing, I mean, this is really, really horrendous stuff. And if you're, a left-wing person in the United States, you need to look into the history of who these Ukrainian nationalist elements are, right? One of the most right-wing conservative newspapers in the United States is called the Washington Times. And it was started by the Reverend Sun Myung Moon, the cult leader of the Unification Church. And they were part of what was called the World Anti-Communist League, which was a CIA-led fascist coalition that was started in Taiwan. Goes back to the 1950s. And it was just a whole network for funding extremist forces around the world to fight Russia, to fight China, to fight the Soviet Union. And these Azov battalion forces, these Ukrainian ultranationalists, that's their roots. They come out of the World Anti-Communist League. They come out of Reverend Sun Myung Moon. They come out of Chiang Kai-shek. These are not democracy lovers. These are not freedom fighters. These are very, very hateful people who advocate fascism, ethno-nationalists, and what's shocking to me is how much U.S. mainstream media is covering up for them. I mean, these people are tearing down World War II memorials. These people, they are building memorials to Stepan Bandera, who was a Nazi collaborator and a participant in the Holocaust. They get on TV and slip every so often and start talking about how blonde-haired, blue-eyed people are dying. The Europeans are dying. I mean, they make it really obvious what they're about, but mainstream media is covering for them. It's deeply frustrating to see, but we're only getting one side of the story in mainstream media. And a lot of that one side of the story is being completely debunked as fake news.
Yeah, and I just want your comment on you talked about these fascists or band right fascists, but it's kind of weird, Caleb, to me how in the United States there was so much of a focus on vilifying the trucker convoy, and crushing them because they were petty bourgeois and how they were, they weren't real working class, and there was like one Nazi flag in that whole thing, and it was just plastered all over the media. And also, you could go to Trump supporters and the Proud Boys and the Boogaloo Boys and all of that. I mean, for interviewing Magnus Pamvidya, who was a libertarian, I would say more than anything, who was part of the Proud Boys, we were labeled like
he was a
Red
Boogaloo
Brown
Boy.
Alliance. I'm sorry, a Boogaloo Boy. Not a Proud Boy, but we were labeled like Red Brown Alliance. We were labeled all these things, and as you have been. The moment there is a legitimate funding and backing with receipts, with historical context, historical data, that the United States helped fund and arm neo-Nazis, and that Victoria Nuland was deciding who was going to be president and said, I don't want Yanukovych. I mean, there's phone calls, there's audio, there's countless evidence. A great portion of the left is completely ignoring that. And you talked about BreadTube loves imperialism, and you've talked about these things, but I just wanted to hear what you thought about that sort of ironic situation that we find ourselves in, because I mean, I'm an anti-fascist, and as you are as well, and I just see so much just complete whitewashing and dismissal of these people being Nazis because Zelensky is Jewish.
Yeah, I mean, this has been kind of my obsession over the past couple of years. I've done a lot of research. I wrote, my book on Kamala Harris. I wrote my book, BreadTube Serves Imperialism. And it started during the Cold War. You started to see covert funding. The CIA started giving money to Trotskyites, to anarchists, and to other elements of the left that were against the Soviet Union and against the Communist Party. And that started during the Cold War, and a lot of money was funneled to these people. It was the Congress for Cultural Freedom program, Project MKUltra, where the CIA was, working to promote drug culture. And you had a whole kind of reinvention of what it means to be a leftist and a socialist in the United States. And then after the Soviet Union fell, these institutions were still there. You had George Soros, this Hungarian billionaire who presented himself as a progressive, but was handing out money all across the Eastern Bloc to help bring down the Soviet Union. And now that the Cold War is over, and now that communism is not the main enemy of the United States around the world, the USA goes around fighting the vague enemy of totalitarianism, not communism or authoritarianism, right? And that the enemies of the United States around the world are ideologically diverse. Now that that's the case, it seems like what started during the Cold War as an attempt to manipulate leftism has emerged into like the primary ideological wing of American imperialism. Basically, the synthetic left, the George Soros Foundation funded academic, university, privileged politics, postmodern left. That is the main, current of U.S. imperialism. And what they believe is not really a threat to the status quo. They don't want to abolish capitalism. They just want to start a worker co-op. They don't want to abolish the system of imperialism. They simply want to, make sure that there are people of color and women and trans people represented at the top of it. And that is the main current of imperialism. Whereas it seems like on the right, you have a lot of people that, their ideology might be very conservative. They might say communism is the main threat. They might really love capitalism, be libertarian. But they're against the status quo. They're against the wars. They're questioning what the corporate media says. So we have a very, very strange political situation. And in that situation, if you are a legit leftist who is against the Pentagon, who is against Wall Street, you're going to realize that you need to be talking to the people on the right, and that a lot of these people on the so-called left who equate you with a Nazi just because you're questioning the Wall Street war narrative, they're not your friends. And I have been at the forefront, along with the Center for Political Innovation, of beating the drum that we need to reevaluate what socialism means. And we need to reorient left-wing activism in the United States. I've said out of the movement to the masses.
Yeah. Being that you're here too as well, it's, I just want to point out a lot of people who, I try to talk to, like, my mother or her friends, a lot of conservatives, whatnot. They do think that communism is the antichrist of sorts. They do think it's the problem because of centralized power. And I often mention how many times that, like, no, I mean, that's not what socialism is about. That Caleb has let us come to his group and talk about censorship and how important it is to hear all points of view. It's so ironic that right now that RT America is closed down, as we had met coming to speak about censorship. But how do you sell socialism to a lot of these conservatives and stuff? I asked one of your colleagues, why not just change the name? Why not call it something different? I've heard you say that America is going to get its own, if we do kind of venture down this avenue, it's going to get its own brand of socialism. So why don't we rebrand it?
Well, I have often said that, Soviet style communism is not coming back anytime soon. The Soviet Union fell for a reason. I mean, the Soviet Union had great successes. They defeated the Nazis. They invented space travel. They raised millions of people from poverty. They electrified the whole country. They wiped out illiteracy. They made Russia a modern country. I mean, they achieved amazing things, but they also had some real big problems. And those problems ultimately played a role in their demise in 1991. And if you look at, communism around the world, not in the West, not, some, academic, some college professor who thinks he's a Marxist, not some, 20-year-old who hates Republicans and is going around saying he's a Marxist. But if you look at what the Nicaraguans are doing, if you look at what the Chinese are doing, if you look at what, what they're doing in various parts of the world, what the People's Republic of Donetsk and Lugansk are doing, those folks believe in communism, but it's a different kind of communism. Hugo Chavez used the word 21st century socialism. And these folks understand that you need a market sector. People ought to be able to open their own business and such. And, you can't be hostile to people for their religious faith. Hugo Chavez was Roman Catholic. Nicolas Maduro is Roman Catholic. The leader of Nicaragua, Daniel Ortega, is also Roman Catholic. And their religious faith is a big part of the government there. They say Christianity, socialism, and solidarity. So, a lot has changed. President Xi Jinping has kind of mixed Marxism with traditional Chinese culture and Confucianism, and that socialism around the world, the countries that are still building a non-capitalist economy, have greatly changed and adjusted since the Cold War. And socialism in the West has also completely changed and been completely manipulated by government money and CIA, manipulation and infiltration. And so the left in the West is just completely pro-imperialist and completely lost its mind. The left in the developing world, in countries like Vietnam, the socialism and Marxism that they are advocating is quite interesting and unique.